All right, so this is mostly a talk about game theory, which as a discipline is right about as old as general purpose computing. It was founded in 1944 by Oscar Morgenstern and this other guy by the name of John von Neumann. So as a field, game theory is considered part of economics, which is really the study of decision making. It's way more than just, microeconomics, macroeconomics, where money goes. This is about decision making about all kinds of resources. And it's always seemed strange to me that the study of making better and better decisions is referred to as the dismal science. Although, to be fair, the more that you look at the problem of allocating finite resources, the more hard truths you end up running up against about both physics and human nature. So what I like about game theory is that it provides a framework for refining our decision-making models as more information about the structure of the data that we encounter comes in. And we're gonna build up a model for what these kinds of structures can look like throughout the course of the talk, starting very simple and moving up to games as complex as an entire society. So, why am I not actually getting my speaker notes? That's really irritating. Okay, so I don't like boring problems. And there are a lot of, hold on. That's going to be a problem. All right. So I don't like boring problems, and if you followed my language theoretic security work at all, you already know this because we're taking individual problems of things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, hoisting them up to the meta level, saying what's the structure that's really going on here? How can we turn making sure that the input we care about is actually the input we want into a tractable, decidable problem? I especially hate solving the same damn problem over and over and over again. Again, I like solutions that generalize. Unfortunately, most of the internet is the same fucking boring problem over and over again, both when it comes to decidable problems like injection and completely undecidable problems like how do humans cooperate and not get into giant fights all the time. And this applies, both in terms of I have a bunch of data sitting in the cloud, people access it. How can I tell whether the people who are trying to access it are doing so legitimately or not? And on social media. I mean, this is not my circus. These are not my monkeys. I'm just tired of it, and so I want to solve the problem. Keith Alexander is consulting for $600,000 a month right now on the grounds of some kind of behavior analytics secret sauce. So, I mean, other people are thinking about the problems of how do we predict how other people are going to behave. So, other things that we will see in this talk include some information theory. Keep the Shannon-Weaver model of communication in your head. There will be two endpoints communicating over a possibly noisy channel that has finite bandwidth. They have to serialize their messages to the channel, and they have to parse incoming messages off the channel. And both serialization and parsing can produce errors. There will also be quite a bit of probability theory, although we're going to be pushing most of that under the hood of a library that CPFR here is responsible for. This is not really a Langsec talk, but we're still going to be talking about boundaries of confidence, particularly in signaling games, which involve people communicating to each other and then taking some action. In a signaling game, how much confidence you can have in the signal that you receive being the one that was actually transmitted, again, that Shannon-Weaver problem, that's going to depend on how reliably you can receive signals in the language of the channel. If the language is Spanish and, you're getting by with what you learned in kindergarten, you're not going to be receiving messages very reliably. How reliably the sender serializes them also matters. We won't be getting super deep into feedback loops, but if you know how they work, it could be useful to keep them in mind. I also kind of lied about the only math you need being the ability to compare two numbers. It will help later in the talk if you can read first-order logic notation, but it doesn't actually matter. I'll explain it all in English. And also Haskell. That's his fault. So, when an unknown agent acts, how do you react to what they do? There are a number of things that you can take into account informationally when you're making this decision. First of all, what kind of side effects does it have on the surrounding environment? What kind of signals does it send? This is so important that they named an entire class of games after them. Interactions that have happened in the past, both with you and with other entities. You know, here the quality of your data is really important. You know, if you're getting fed noisy information about how an agent has interacted with other agents in the past, the extent to which that can help you is limited, although there are probabilistic methods that can make that a little better. Again, there won't be all that much of an appearance of Langsec in this talk, but when all of the agents are machines, this is relevant. You know, I mentioned, Keith Alexander's behavior modeling stuff earlier, but, you know, think about the DARPA CyberGrand Challenge. Who do you think is going to be driving all of those automated exploit generators? People? I mean, at first, probably, yeah, but, you know, not forever. Drones are expensive, and, you know, if your drone goes down, you want someone to blame. More servers, you can spin those up any goddamn time. And in any case, being able to tell where formal language theory matters, which is to say which problems are decidable and which problems aren't, is an important distinction. Decidable problems are priceless. For everything else, there's heuristics, and when those inevitably fail, there's MasterCard. And so game theory is the framework that we will be building up this knowledge around, but we'll be pulling from all of these fields that I just mentioned. So this talk is basically divided into 3 parts. We're going to start out talking about classical game theory, which is 2 players, just 1 interaction, 2 choices, you know, very, very simple conceptual framework that we're then going to expand on. We'll start with the mathematical explanation of it, and then take a look at how it's been used in psychology. Then we're going to take a look at how games that last longer than 1 move can change over time. We'll start with the extensive form of iterated games, which basically expands a matrix out into a tree that you're then basically moving around and pruning other people's branches off of. And then we'll also look at multiplayer games and games that run for many, many rounds. And finally, then we're going to shift tactics and take a look at, okay, well, if all we have is data and we have to infer structure, how do we go about doing that? So, on to classical game theory. All right, so the definition of a game includes 4 elements. A game has players, actors who take some actions. Those actors have information available to them when they make decisions. They have a set of possible actions at each point where they have to make a decision. And there is some set of payoffs for each outcome. In the classical case, we assume that the players know what the payoffs are, but later on we'll be looking at what happens when you don't actually know what the payoffs are. So, from these 4 properties that define a game, we can derive strategies that suggest how players ought to play. A pure strategy is, at each turn, there is 1 obvious move you should make. A mixed strategy is, at each move, there's some probability distribution over moves that you could make. There's also a thing called behavior strategies, which are similar to mixed strategies, but we'll look more closely at them later. Another property that falls out of the base structure is an equilibrium. An equilibrium is a state from which all players have made their choices, and it would not be rational for any of them to make a different choice. They would be subjecting themselves to a loss of some kind if they were to change their move. And this can sometimes result in situations where there's a better possible outcome than the one that you could get at equilibrium, but it's in nobody's self-interest to make the choice that would lead to that better cooperative outcome, and so nobody actually makes the choice. And we'll also see that the structure of games also defines what kinds of equilibrium they can have. There are refinements on equilibrium where it becomes resistant to things like noise. But again, we'll look at that later as well. Okay, so this is what a normal form game looks like. This is a generic structure. On the axes, we have actions, cooperate and defect. Those are just kind of the generic actions that that people assign to actions in a game. They can be other things, which we'll see in a moment. You know, cooperate and defect sounds like it's kind of morally valenced, but actions themselves are not necessarily. So the text in red corresponds to the row player. It's the rows are what's annotated, or the rows are where the red is on the axis. Blue is the column player. And in the cells of the matrix, we have the payoffs that each player gets if those two actions are chosen. So if both players cooperate, red gets the A payoff and blue gets the B payoff. If they both defect, red gets the G payoff and blue gets the H payoff, etc. So I mentioned strategies before. If there is a pure strategy for the game, then that's at every situation there is one obvious move. For a mixed strategy, there's a probability distribution over possible moves, and you're basically rolling the dice at every step of the game tree. And then behavioral strategies assign probabilities at information sets. So they're functionally equivalent as long as the player has perfect recall. Behavioral strategies are more, what happens if players have faulty memories, which is a little more like how people actually act in real life. So, the prisoner's dilemma. This was first described in 1950 by Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher. And there are 4 payoffs total in the game. The payoff that you get for screwing the other guy, D and E. In this case, you'll notice that the best you can do in this game is 0. So the idea here is, you've got 2 prisoners. They both have information on what the other person did, and the police want them to rat out their buddy. So cooperating is saying, nope, I'm not going to snitch, and defecting is ratting out your buddy. So if you both cooperate and refuse to rat each other out, then the cops find some minor thing to get you both on, and you both do a year in jail. But that's all. If you turn in your buddy and your buddy doesn't snitch on you, then you go free and your buddy does 3 years. And if you both snitch on each other, then you both do 2 years. So the temptation is go free. The reward is do just 1 year. The punishment is do 2 years, and then the sucker payoff, what you get if you're the cooperator who gets defected on, is you do 3 years in jail. So a couple of properties that fall out of this. The reward payoff is greater than the punishment payoff, and this ends up meaning that mutual cooperation is better than mutual defection, which is kind of obvious. It's better to only do 1 year in jail than to do 2 years in jail. However, because the temptation is greater than the reward, the temptation for screwing your buddy is greater than, and going free is greater than the reward of only doing a year in jail. And also the payoff for both of you defecting, the punishment payoff, is greater than the you got screwed over payoff. defecting is the dominant strategy for both agents. So mutually, cooperation is useful, but in terms of self-interest, it is in neither agent's self-interest to cooperate instead of defecting. So this is a dilemma. You know, at the individual level, defection is superior to cooperation, and it's individuals who act. So here's another game that doesn't quite have that moral loading of cooperation and defection. This game is basically rock, paper, scissors, but you only have two options. You have a penny, and your opponent has a penny, and each of you choose to turn the penny to either heads or tails, and then you reveal your choice at the same time, and the matrix describes the payoffs. So there is no pure strategy that is a best response here, because what you always want is the opposite of what your opponent picked. So if you're playing this over and over and over again, kind of like if you're playing rock, paper, scissors over and over and over again, you might be able to infer some pattern in how your opponent makes those choices. But in the one round case, you really can't do better than random. So this game has an even different set of properties. It's called deadlock. So the idea here is that the outcome that is best for everybody also happens to be the dominant outcome. There's not any conflict between self-interest and mutual benefit. So I mean, this is really kind of a boring game, right? The obvious choice is just defect, and go on with the rest of your life. But it's kind of an interesting basis for a signaling game, because there is a little bit of incentive to screw the other guy. All right, so now this type of game is a cooperation game. Jean-Jacques Rousseau originally described this long before game theory was even a glimmer in von Neumann's eye. He described the problem of, you've got two hunters, and they're going out to the woods to hunt, and they can either work together to bring down a stag, or they can go off alone and shoot rabbits. So if they agree to go hunt stag, and one of them decides in the middle, oh, screw it, I'm just going to go get a rabbit instead, then his buddy goes home with nothing, and he goes home with a rabbit. But if they decide to cooperate, then they both come home with more than they would have had. So there are actually two pure strategy equilibria here. You're better off either always cooperating or always defecting. We say that cooperating is payoff dominant and defecting is risk dominant. So in the stag hunt, people had to coordinate in order to obtain the best payoff. In the game of chicken, where you and your opponent are driving down a road, and each of you has to decide whether to swerve at the last minute or keep going. This is more of an anti-coordination game, because if you choose the same action, particularly if that action is going straight, you produce the extremely large negative externality of crashing your car and probably dying. And then, of course, if you both swerve, then, well, you know, you're both equally wimps. What we're seeing, by the way, at the bottom here with all of these inequalities is really just defining a partial order on the payoffs. Any game that has this kind of ordering of the payoffs is an instance of this class of game. So with chicken, there's actually a really interesting variant of it called Hawk and Dove, which was proposed by John Maynard Smith and George Price in 1973 in Nature to describe conflict over resources among animals. So not even rational at all, just how do animals make choices. I mean, game theory usually assumes that the actors are rational, but you know, when you're modeling animals, basically all you can do is say, yep, they got preferences, they try and satisfy them. So here, V is the value of the resource that's in dispute. So if you share it, then you split it. And C is the cost of getting into a fight. So, you know, if you both decide to fight, then you basically split you split the reward and the cost of having gotten into a fight. So this is also often examined as a signaling game, because there's a if you include a round where the players get to threaten each other before they choose what their moves are, and the credibility of that signal may influence whether the player takes an action or not. And, you know, credibility is usually modeled pretty fuzzily. And I haven't actually gotten to this point in the code that we're going to be presenting later, but I would ultimately like to get to the point where we can actually make, you know, reasonable heuristic estimations of, like, you know, how much can I actually trust this signal that I'm receiving. So this is another coordination game that's also known as conflicting interest coordination. The idea here is you've got, you know, one partner wants to go to the opera, the other one wants to go to the ball game, but they'd rather be together than go to different events. And they've forgotten they've forgotten which thing they're going to go to tonight. Each one knows that the other one forgot, and they can't communicate, like they lost their cell phones or something. So where should each of them go? So on the pure strategy level, again, we have two equilibria, kind of like the stag hunt. Either both people go to the opera or both people go to the ball game. But that's not really fair, because that means that one person is consistently getting a higher payoff than the other. And usually in a coordination game, you know, you want to try to be fair to the other person. There's also a mixed strategy, which is go to the event that you like best with 60% probability, which you can see essentially as a sum of the payoffs. You know, your preferred event. You know, if you prefer it, then you get a payoff of 3 out of the total of 5, so that's 3/5 of 60%. But that's inefficient, because players end up miscoordinating more than half of the time, about 52% of the time. So the expected utility is only 1.2 instead of the 3 that you would expect to get. So, you know, over time, you're going to miss each other so often that you really would have been better off just deciding, okay, I'm always going to go to that thing I hate. So, what have we seen so far? First of all, games can be zero-sum or they can be non-zero-sum. In a zero-sum game, the gains and the losses of all of the players balance out to 0. So the matching pennies game is zero-sum, but the prisoner's dilemma and the stag hunt are not. All zero-sum games are competitive. People are, you know, contesting a finite pool of stuff. Non-zero-sum games can be competitive or non-competitive, and really way more games are non-zero-sum than are zero-sum anyway, so they're more interesting. So let's see. We talked about conflict and cooperation. You know, coordination is hard. And when your payoff matrix is structured in such a way that it incentivizes doing the self-interested thing at the individual level, you know, trust comes into the picture. You have to figure out, okay, you know, how am I going to decide whether I'm going to rely on this person actually doing what they signaled they were going to do? But an action is just an action. You know, there's nothing inherently good or bad about choosing heads or tails in matching pennies. Furthermore, the morality of snitching in the prisoner's dilemma depends on what your ethical framework is about snitching, and the morality of going off to hunt rabbits in the stag hunt depends on whether you agreed to hunt a stag first and how seriously you take keeping your word. But as we go on, we'll be looking at more complicated games, ones that go on for longer, ones that have more players, ones where players have uncertain information about each other, and even ones where the game that is being played changes form as the game goes on. But before that, I just want to talk about a couple of the different kinds of equilibrium. So game theoretic equilibrium really has its roots in the idea of Cournot equilibrium, which was established by Antoine-Augustin Cournot in 1838. So he was talking about businesses like factories or, you know, shoemakers, you know, people who are producing some product and they're in a market with other actors who are producing that product and other products, and they have to decide what how much are they going to produce of what in order to maximize their profit. So Nash equilibrium we've already talked about. That's where each actor is making the best decision that they can given what they know about each other's decisions. And this is really a generalization of the Cournot equilibrium in that in the Nash equilibrium case, you're not necessarily trying to maximize your output. You're trying to maximize something else. And we ball up all of the possible something else's into this meta concept of payoff. But it goes further. So a subgame is a subset of the tree of a game. And in subgame perfect equilibrium, all subgames have a Nash equilibrium. So if you have a game that exhibits subgame perfect equilibrium, you can start at the outcomes and then work backward, pruning off branches that would involve a player making a move that they are not incentivized to make, which is to say a non-optimal move. And it gets better. Some games even exhibit a thing called trembling hand equilibrium, where there's a possibility that a player might just do the wrong thing. Your hand might slip and you hit the big red button instead of picking up the phone to call the Kremlin and say, hey, the war is off. So what this ends up meaning in practice is that if you can structure the payoffs of a game you expect to play such that that game exhibits a more refined equilibrium, you have more tools to make decisions. How much you can actually influence the payoffs is a very open question, but that's essentially what these are useful for. So now let's move on to psychology. So traditional game theory assumes that all agents are rational. But in the 1960s, Eric Berne looked at irrational games, basically. The kinds of social games that people entice each other into for attention or for sympathy or for other kinds of psychological payoffs while hiding their true motives. And the ulterior part is the important part. That's what distinguishes Berne's games from like the more general game theory games. So he drops the assumption that players are driven by the most rational agents of their nature. And he looks at the payoffs of these ulterior motive social games as ways for players to satisfy unmet emotional needs. So in effect, we're now considering players to have two sets of preferences that impact their decision making. One that System 2 in Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow terminology. System 2 is your rational mind, and so you use one set of preferences when you're making considered decisions, but you have an entirely different set of preferences that your pre-rational System 1 uses for making quick heuristic decisions. And these might be decisions driven by emotion or driven by training that you've had. So humans are social animals. We all have biological drives to interact with other members of our species to some extent or another. And when that drive demands to be satisfied, an argument can serve the exact same purpose as a productive discussion or even a hug if what a person is fundamentally looking for is just external recognition that they exist at all. So payoff basically comes, in a biochemical level here in the form of neurotransmitter activity. So Berne was doing this stuff in the 60s, and they were just figuring out Parkinson's then. So we didn't know a whole lot about the role of dopamine in addiction or anything like that. And the imaging equipment that we need to investigate this directly is either still really expensive or doesn't exist. But we can black box it. And what I actually use in my own mental model is behaviorism. The idea is that each player experiences some consequences from each interaction, either as reinforcement or as punishment. So there's positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. So positive reinforcement is a rewarding stimulus, like a candy or a kiss. Negative reinforcement is when an aversive stimulus goes away. So they stop beating you because the morale improved. Positive punishment, on the other hand, sounds kind of paradoxical, but it's an aversive stimulus, somebody yelling at you. And then negative reinforcement is removal of a rewarding stimulus. You know, they take the foosball table away. And Berne identified a couple of different sort of primal hungers that people seek to have satisfied by playing games. Stimulus hunger, recognition hunger, and structure hunger. It's probably also useful to think about status hunger, although that's also probably a combination of recognition hunger and structure hunger. So, Berne enumerated about 5 general types of interactions. First of all, procedures, a series of complementary transactions towards some physical end. You know, you're putting a bike together. Operations are similar to procedures. They're a set of transactions that you undertake for some stated purpose. You know, if you ask explicitly for something like reassurance or support and you get it, that's an operation. A ritual is a stereotyped series of simple complementary transactions, you know, just one complementing the other. Berne says programmed by external social forces. But basically what he's saying here is, you know, when you say hi to the guy up the street, you know, there's kind of a ritual for how you say hello to each other and how long you go on talking before you both go on your way. So a pastime is an iterated ritual, and it carries state. People spend a lot of time on pastimes, which is kind of where they're called that. For most people, Facebook is largely a pastime. Ditto for Twitter. This can, and because pastimes can carry state, they have the potential to turn into status gaming, you know, as sort of a pecking order gets established. And when different clusters that have, you know, they use the same game board for their pastime. You know, they're all on Facebook or they're all on Twitter, but they're different clusters and they have sort of different their own group norms for how discourse should work. You end up getting fireworks because pastimes have this ritual quality. You know, they include jargon. You know, you kind of have to speak the lingo. They include signaling of certain beliefs. And if you don't know what pre-existing state you're walking into, you may very well end up sending a signal that upsets a whole bunch of people, and then suddenly you have the whole internet on your ass. And finally, the games that Berne calls games are specifically a series of ulterior transactions. So the person who starts it is hiding their motives, and they're trying to progress to, you know, a predictable outcome. They have some goal in mind, but they're not being upfront about what that goal is. So, you know, we said that you know, if you ask for reassurance and you get it, that's an operation. You know, if you ask for reassurance, but then you flip that around on the person and use it to make them feel bad somehow, that's a game. So, Berne's games also have some structure. They have players. The players take actions in response to each other, and there are payoffs. He talks about 5 of them. Existential advantage seems pretty similar to confirmation bias to me. I think, you know, it seems like there's some similar machinery going on there. You know, you believed something about the state of the world, like, you know, all Martians are pigs or something, and playing the game out to its end confirms that in some way. You know, and so it's that sense that events in the world are confirming your beliefs about how the world works, even if you actually manipulated the events towards that end. So internal psychological advantage is just the raw emotional payoff, pretty much analogous to positive reinforcement. And similarly, external psychological advantage is analogous to negative reinforcement. If you win, you're raising the likelihood that you'll behave that way again because you've reinforced the evidence that playing games works. And then you've also got internal and external social advantage, which are basically about status and limiting other players' moves. If you signal that you're oppressed, people who think that oppression is important are going to limit their own actions on your behalf, and this is exploitable. So what are some examples of these ulterior motive games that Berne describes? Kick me. So the idea behind this is, somebody really just wants sympathy, and so they just go around and being as annoying as possible until somebody just takes the punch, and then you complain about it, and you're trying to basically one up people and say, oh, I'm way worse off than you are, give me sympathy, give me sympathy. Another one, ain't it awful? The way he describes this, it can be a pastime, people complaining about, oh, the state of the world is so terrible, and just sort of taking turns, describing how great things used to be in the old days and how it isn't now. But it can also manifest as a game. If the player displays distress, and they get sympathy and help in response to that distress, that can be pretty seductive, and taken to the pathological extreme, that's called Munchausen syndrome, or Munchausen by proxy. Actually, that's just one possible extreme of that. Another one, why don't you yes but? So what the initiator really wants is reassurance that their problem is not their fault, but they get it in a manipulative way by challenging people to find a solution that they can't find fault with. They don't really want a solution. They just want to be reassured that it's not their fault, and so they can nitpick anything to death. Another one that we see a lot on the internet, courtroom. Pick some victim, basically a scapegoat, and then just verbally tear them apart. In front of a judge if you can. This is what happens when Bobby and Susie are arguing over a toy, and Bobby says, Susie hit me, and mom has to decide between the two. But on the internet, we often get this acephalous, all jury, all self-appointed jury version that I don't think Berne really anticipated. So the Badger game is actually a classic con job. So the idea here is guy picks up a woman in a bar. She takes him off to a hotel room, and in flagrante delicto, her husband or her boyfriend shows up and threatens to either and threatens to beat the hell out of the guy, and the Confederate and the aggressor basically nudge the guy to just give up his wallet and you can leave. So it can be for Berne called this game "Now I've Got You, You Son of a Bitch," and you can play it two-handed with just a victim and just an aggressor, as long as the victim does something that the aggressor can construe as the victim screwing up in some way. But with the Confederate, then the Confederate and the aggressor work together. The Confederate lures the victim into provoking the aggressor, who then accuses the victim of, hey, what are you doing with my wife? The victim defends himself and is, and that's when you get the shift to, well, maybe you just, we'll let you go if you just give us your wallet. He tries to defend himself and ends up either getting beat up or giving up the wallet. And trolling. Another one that I don't think Berne anticipated, but it's basically the schlemiel game. It's often about getting the target to embarrass themselves in some way, typically by overreacting and saying something that they're going to regret later, although, to be honest, I really doubt whether the target ever actually does regret it later, but, we'll set that aside for now. So the idea is the troll provokes somebody who, then has a bunch of resentment to deal with, and they have to decide, am I going to yell at this person or just, suck it up and be the better person and take it? Lather, rinse, repeat. And if B snaps, then player A appears justified in stepping it up and just accelerating it. So, but if they keep their cool, you know, the person still just keeps pushing the boundary and pushing the boundary. So, you know, it's really it's a losing game for the person being trolled either way. You know, Byrne talks about there being a phase of the game, I guess, in situations where people expect to see each other again, like, you know, we're part of the same social circle and run into each other at parties, where there's this apology and forgiveness phase where the person apologizes for screwing up and then basically just takes that as license to go run around screwing up more and more and more. But trolls aren't really in it for the forgiveness, so this might be better considered a modification of that game. So notice that a troll's actions revolve pretty much entirely around sending signals to some receiver in an attempt to provoke an overreaction. So if you engage, that's a feedback loop that provides the troll with more material to feed into its signal generation function. So the only winning move is really not to play. And on that note, let's take a closer look at the class of games that we can use to model interactions involving two-way communication, signaling games. Well, but actually, yeah, I'm actually running out of time, so I'm going to skip this slide. Yeah. So, this is from a British game show called Golden Balls. Get your laughter out of the way now, because you know, you're going to hear in the video clips to follow. You're going to hear this. You're going to hear the word balls more often than any other noun in any of the clips that follow. I know, I counted. So, hang on. I'm going to have to restart that. Just a second. Audio issues. That's on. Okay. Here. I hope this works. Damn it. Okay, one more try.
You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You both have a ball with the word steal written inside. You will know which is split and which is steal because you're going to have a look.
All right. So, that was the setup. Let's talk about what this game actually involves. So, this is the very beginning of an extensive form game tree for this game. The empty dot in the middle is the root, and that indicates who makes the first move, in this case, the first player. So traditionally, nature makes the first move, and that move is considered to be choosing the type of the player. You know, in a job interview, is the candidate that you're interviewing competent or incompetent? When you buy somebody a drink, are they interested in you or are they not interested in you? If you're deciding whether to tell somebody a secret, are they trustworthy or are they untrustworthy? But since the first player has already decided whether he's going to split or steal, he's going to make the first move.
If you both pick the split ball, you split the 13,600 and you go home with 6,800 each.
Can any of you even hear that? Okay, yeah, I'm also not able to get, for some reason I'm not able to get this playing on the projector either. But we'll try to move on. Okay, so we're building out the game tree here. So, hang on. There we go. So from the split branch, we see that there are two possible signals that player one, the red player, can send. So it branches out to signal A or signal B. If player two also picks split, then they split the 13,000. What happens if one of them splits and one of them steals?
If one of you chooses the steal ball and the other chooses the split ball, whoever chooses the steal ball goes home with the whole lot, 13,600.
So this expands the steal branch for both sides. both on the right, where we now know what happens if the red player steals and the blue player splits, and on the left, where we know what happens if the red player splits and the blue player steals. Oh, there we go.
Both choose the steal ball. You leave today's game with what you came with. Nothing.
Okay, and finishing out the graph, we now have the branches for what happens if both players steal. They all end up going home with nothing. So this game has a normal form. It's similar to the prisoner's dilemma, but not quite the same, because of the fact that the payoff for both players stealing is the same as the sucker payoff for if you get defected on. So this is also known as the friend or foe game. So at this point, the players observe the actions available to them. Whoops. Except it apparently doesn't want to play. All right, screw it. Yeah, basically they both take a look at the balls in front of them and recognize that yes, one is split and one is steal. They're about to, actually. So at this point we've got the signaling part filled in. So Nick is either going to signal that he's likely to split or that he's likely to steal. And then Ibrahim, the other guy, is going to have to make his decision based on what, how credible he believes Nick's signal to be. So now they're going to signal to each other.
Ibrahim, I want you to trust me. 100% I'm going to pick the steal ball.
Sorry, you're going to...
I'm going to choose the steal ball.
You're going to take the
I
steal.
want you to do split, and I promise you that I will split the money with you.
Well, after you've took the steal.
Yeah.
You're going to take steal.
Yeah.
I'm going to take split.
Yeah.
So you take the money.
And I will split it with you.
After the
Sorry.
show.
Yeah. Ibrahim, I promise you I'll do that. If you do steal, we both walk away with nothing. I'm telling you 100% I'm going to do it.
I appreciate that. Right, I'll give you another alternative. Why don't we just both pick split?
I'm not going to pick split. I'm going to steal. Ibrahim, honestly, 100% I'm going to steal.
It's in your nature to steal.
No, I'm honest, and I'm going to tell you...
You're an honest man.
I am. That's why I'm telling you I'm going to steal. If you do split, then I will split the money.
I can't see myself doing that.
Okay, well, I'm going to steal, so we're going to leave with nothing.
Where's your brains coming from? I can't work out...
I know that I'm a decent guy, and I will split the money with you.
Well, we should just both split then.
No, I'm going to do steal.
There is no legal
requirement
for him to give you the money.
Of course. If I gave you my word... Now, let me tell you what my word means.
Okay.
My father once said to me, a man who doesn't keep his word is not a man. He's not worth nothing. Not worth a dollar.
I agree.
So...
Ibrahim, I'm going to steal. So you've got the choice. You either steal, and we both walk away with nothing, because you know I've told you my intention, and I've told you that I will split the money with you, Ibrahim.
If I gave you my word that I was going to split, I would split. And you're going to take steal, so...
The only way you can guarantee to walk away with 6,800
is by
to
sharing.
guarantee that you both put the split ball in. And I do now have to push you for a decision. It's a tough one.
We've lost it. We've lost everything.
Okay. Class then.
We're walking away with no money because you're an idiot.
No, that's not
You're an
true.
idiot. You're an idiot. That's what's right. You're an idiot. You're an idiot. That's what you are.
This can go on all night, and these people have got to get up for breakfast. Nick, choose split or steal. Ibrahim, choose split or steal. Now, please. Choose a ball.
Right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go with you.
Okay.
I'm going to go with
I promise you I will split it.
All right, quick audience poll. Who thinks that Ibrahim is going to choose steal? Ibrahim is the guy on the left. Who thinks that Ibrahim is going to choose steal? Who thinks that Ibrahim is going to choose split? All right, who thinks that Nick is going to choose steal? Who thinks that Nick is going to choose split? All right. I just want to point out that Radiolab interviewed both these guys after the show, and it was pointed out that, like, in the studio, the argument went on for 45 minutes, and the audience was booing Nick over and over again. He stuck to his guns the entire freaking time. So, you know, in uncompressed time, that signal was pretty unambiguous. But boy, he had to go through a lot of work to send it. So, we now see that Nick has signaled that he is likely to steal. But these dots here mean that Ibrahim doesn't really know what action he actually took. So we have to consider both ends of the graph. But he's signaled that he's likely to steal so convincingly that we can basically ignore this entire upper half of the graph. So now what actually happens?
Split or steal? Yes, congratulations, you have both split and each received £6,800.
Yeah, as he described it later, Nick conned him into 6,800 pounds. So now we have the complete path through the graph, where we see that Nick actually chose split, but signaled that he was likely to steal. Because, I mean, on the... sure, it's true that he could have, you know, chosen steal and just given him the 13,600 after the show, but the outcome, you know, actually works out better if you just follow the rules and lie. So, you know, he signaled, you know, but we didn't know before, you know, whether Nick had actually chosen split or steal. He had signaled unambiguously that he planned to, but, you know, Nick's signal changed the structure of the game that they were playing. It went from being friend or foe to ultimatum. Ultimatum is the game where, you know, there's an amount of money, you get to propose how to split it, and another person gets to choose yes or no. That's literally what's just happened here. So the risk that Nick is taking is whether Ibrahim is going to decide that the ultimatum is so insulting that he should punish Nick by forcing them both to go home with nothing, or whether the promise of 6,800 pounds after the show is a credible enough incentive that he ought to cooperate. So the takeaway here should be that, you know, extensive form helps you see how the structure of a game changes as branches of the decision tree get pruned away. And with that, let's move on to larger games involving societies and lots more information. But we're going to start with iterated games. So Axelrod, Robert Axelrod in 1981 took a look at what happens when you play the same game with another person over and over and over again, and you can remember what happened. So now, instead of just the payoff matrix, your strategy also depends on history. And so in 1981, he ran a bunch of tournaments, playing strategies against each other 200 times, total up the score at the end, to see how well they perform against each other. He also did what he called ecological tournaments, where players can abandon bad strategies. Every strategy's success in the previous round determines how frequently it appears in the current round, and cooperative strategies end up outcompeting non-cooperative ones. You know, as an aside, it would be really awesome if, like, people in the real world actually did abandon bad strategies as soon as they recognized that a strategy wasn't working, but in practice, people are actually really, really awful at this. I mean, people are really invested in the strategies that they choose. You know, there's a bias for that too. It's called choice supportive bias. But what the interesting thing that turned up in these tournaments is that if all you know is how the person you're playing with interacted with you the last time, the best you can do is essentially an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If they punch you, punch back. If they cooperate, cooperate. People tried strategies with more complex inferences, but they didn't work very well because the inferences were usually wrong. So another thing that they determined was that although tit for tat is the best strategy, you know, in the long run, it can't score higher than its opponent, which Axelrod kind of refined into an axiom of don't be envious. Don't try to get one over on the other guy. It also turned out that if you're playing against a tit-for-tat player, the best you can do is cooperate with them, because they won't defect on you if you don't defect on them. And so Axelrod reified this as don't be too clever. Again, if your inferences are wrong, that's not going to help you. So, what properties do iterated games have? First of all, niceness. Success in iterated Prisoner's Dilemma, as it turns out, requires you to not defect on somebody who has not defected on you. And this basically describes, niceness is pretty much cooperation. Successful strategies are also retaliatory, though. If somebody defects on them, they will in fact defect right back. But they're also forgiving, which is to say that if somebody stops defecting on them, they will also stop defecting. However, can we do better than this? Because in the real world, we can get information from other people about how people interact. And we also know that there are plenty of people whose modus operandi is just moving from victim to victim, opportunistically defecting whenever they think they can get away with it. And, BERNE'S games are a fairly socially acceptable example of that kind of behavior. There's certainly, far more dangerous flavors of it as well. So if we have information from other people or other sources, are there strategies that can incorporate that information to expose social predators? So what Ord and Blair said in 2002 is, in fact, yes. If you can take into account all interactions in the past, then you can express strategies in first-order logic. So in the examples that follow, C is the column player, the person you're playing against. R is the row player, that's you. P is the last round, and B is a predecessor function. So tit for tat, defect on the column player, I am the row player, if they defected on me last round. That's it. Tit for two tats. This is another strategy that turned up initially in Axelrod's tournament. Ord tried it in his. It's defect on somebody if they defected me on the last round and the round before last. So Grim is not a nice strategy. Grim will, if at any time the column player has defected on it, it will defect on them forever. There's a somewhat more elaborate version of this that introduces logical knot. Bully says that if at no time the column player has defected on me, if they have always cooperated on me, then sucker punch them. There's another one called Spiteful Bully, which is similar, so Bully will cooperate if you turn around and punch the bully. Spiteful Bully, if you turn around and punch the bully 3 times, he'll keep punching you back. There are also strategies that try to keep the peace between predatory strategies like Bully and Spiteful Bully and Vulture. Vigilante is one of them. So if there is no player, so for Vigilante, it's defect on the column player if the column player defected on anybody else last round. So look at everybody else. This is where information about what's happening in the society comes into play. Similarly, you've got police, where just like tit for tat, if you go up and punch a cop, he'll punch you back. But also, if somebody defects on somebody else who has just cooperated with everybody, the policeman says, okay, you're trying to screw over somebody who always cooperates, I'm going to punish you. So the peacekeeping strategies ignore who somebody defected on. They only care that a person defected. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it turns out that these predatory strategies, oh, sorry, I went too far. So if you start out with a population of 1,050 people, 500 of whom cooperate all the time, 500 of whom play tit for tat, and only 50 of whom are spiteful bullies. Very quickly, the spiteful bullies will just outcompete the cooperators down to zero. It's just you cannot survive in a society with people who are going to punish you like that if you're going to cooperate all the time. However, if you replace the tit for tats with police, you still keep a population of all cooperators, and the spiteful bullies eventually get pushed down to zero. That strategy just does not pay off in the long run. So we can now talk about the concepts of niceness and loyalty. Niceness is more nuanced in a society. There's both individually nice and communally nice. So if you're individually nice, you're not going to defect on somebody who's never defected on you. Similarly, if you're meta-individually nice, you will not defect on a strategy that's individually nice. Whereas if you're communally nice, you won't defect on somebody who has not defected on anybody. So like police, for instance, is communally nice. And then you've also got meta-communally nice that doesn't defect on communally nice strategies. Similarly, there's individually and communally retaliatory and forgiving. If you defect on somebody who defects on you, that's individually retaliatory. If you defect on somebody who defects on anyone, that's communally retaliatory, and so on. So a loyal strategy will not defect on somebody else that's playing the same strategy as it. If tit for tat plays another tit for tat, they will cooperate forever. Ditto for police, but not for vigilante. Vigilantes will defect on other vigilantes. So tit for tat is individually nice, retaliatory, and forgiving, but vigilante is communally nice, retaliatory, and forgiving. All right. So we were talking about, sort of the meta niceness. What do you do about the problem of, not all peacekeepers don't always agree? The police and vigilantes, for instance, will defect on each other. It also turns out that peacekeepers protect strategies that aren't peacekeepers at their own expense. So in this tournament, you have 400 police who are, letting the tit for tats flourish pretty much at their own expense, even though the population of spiteful bullies is kept down, and there are some people who are just able to cooperate all the time still. Then we've got absolutist. So this strategy says defect on the column player if they have ever cooperated with somebody when I defected, or vice versa. So this is a loyal strategy. It does not defect on other absolutists of its own kind. This means that if you put two groups of absolutists into a population, they will defect on each other. This actually showed up in in the tournaments that Ord ran. It is also unforgiving. Just like Grim, once it starts defecting on somebody, it is never going to stop. It is not individually nice. It is not communally nice, because if an all-cooperator cooperates with somebody who has defected on it, it will defect on that all-cooperator. The absolutist says, you're basically tarred by the sins of who you associated with, and I'm not going to deal with you. And the scary thing is, this actually turns out to be a pretty tenable strategy if you look at the numbers. You start out with more all-cooperators than you have absolutists, and very, very quickly you end up with a society full of just camps of absolutists who are defecting on each other. I mean, this is essentially the failure case of internet arguments. And again, I mean, it is pretty terrifying just how few absolutists you have to have in a population to take over. We had 400 in the last slide, but here we've got 50 spiteful bullies, 100 tit for tats, and 500 all Cs. Replace those tit for tats with absolutists, and again, just over 5 generations, it's an all absolutist population. So that should give you a little pause. All right. Does anybody actually have any questions at this point? Because I think I've got like 5 minutes left, and I'd really love to talk about the probabilistic programming stuff, but I just don't think we have time. Yes?
There's a criticism of the business dilemma that the reason actual physicists don't follow it is that they're aware that the game has 3 players, not 2.
Oh, yeah.
How does that sort of hidden hand within the game system play out in these more advanced scenarios?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of ways to model it, right? You can always have the nature player. And that's somebody who plays against everybody and doesn't care about what payoffs happen to it. And that might not be the right that might not be the right model for for a prison warden, because a prison warden has vulnerabilities that can be taken advantage of in some way. Although the ability of the prisoners to affect the warden is pretty limited. It might be reasonable to essentially simplify the warden to nature. Yes.
So looking at practical applications, when I look at information security, it seems like we may not even be getting the signaling enough to even get to the point where we can worry about the games that we're playing.
Yes.
Can you talk about the balance between signaling and actually needing to play the game?
All right, fuck it. I'll try and actually do the last section of this talk in 5 minutes. So, probabilistic programming. All right. So, we're not frequentists. We're absolute probabilities are great, but what happens if it's a one-time event? Estimates are nice, but you'd really like to have probabilities of various outcomes. So, we're gonna use Bayesian probability again. And what's Bayesian probability? It's how confident you are that something is going to happen. So, in Bayesian statistics, we reason from relative probabilities. For a large enough number of samples, the Bayesian and frequentist interpretations typically converge, but a lot of the time you just don't have enough samples to choose from. So, really big data problems can be solved by frequentist analysis, but for medium-sized data and really small data, this little equation here works better. And fuck it, Wikipedia, we got 4 minutes. All right, so probability distributions. Probability distribution functions assign probabilities to outcomes. There are ones for discrete values, like if you need to assign over an enumeration. There are also continuous ones. So discrete probability functions are probability mass functions. The Poisson distribution, that guy is one example. That's actually the expected value of the Poisson distribution. Then you've got continuous, where you're just picking arbitrary precision values within a range. We call that a probability density function, such as the exponential function whose expected outcome is there. And you can also mix those. So when you plot a distribution, the narrower the peak on your graph, the greater your certainty is. So that begins to answer your question. When we have data and we try to fit a model to that data, and we look at how confident we are in that. So you don't know what it is you're unaware of. Game theory is awesome when you know what the payoffs are, but if you don't know what the payoffs are, well, you kind of have to fill in the blanks from what information you do have. So what do you have? Well, you usually have at least some vague idea of who the players are. Not always. I mean, if in a network security scenario, you probably have far less information about who the players are than you would in in a social scenario where you at least know people's names. But you also have some idea of what you can do, as well as what other people might be capable of doing, and you can make educated guesses about that. You can also look at the history, both of people's interactions with you and people's interactions with others, and make inferences over that data. All of these can be random variables. They can be deterministic, which is to say that they're controlled by they're controlled by some inputs, and if we know all of those inputs, then we can figure out exactly what the value is. And then there are stochastic ones where there's still some randomness. So if you are going to simulate a game, first of all, you got to figure out what distribution you're going to use. I mean, you need to figure out, sort of what are you going to model? What does your data describe? What are you interested in? What does that thing that you're interested in look like structurally? And what influences it? This will help you choose. Knowing something about how your data is distributed will help you decide what probability distribution to use. Probability distributions have parameters, and you have to figure out, you know, which parameters you're going to use. You know, you can keep on you can actually assign a distribution to a parameter and just have the model update itself. And you can keep reassigning these distributions to parameters as long as it's useful. But if you don't have any strong beliefs about a parameter, then it's probably actually not useful. So, you know, in that case, you can just pick an average value and let inference update it for you. So from the data, you know a few things about your priors. That helps you fix values in your stochastic random variables. And then you just sample the posterior distribution, which is to say the conditional distribution of some outcome given some parameter, which is to say the probability distribution of y when x is known to be a particular value. So Markov chain Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo simulation happened to also be discovered by John von Neumann. And so in normal Monte Carlo, you've got a bunch of independent and identically distributed variables. They don't influence each other. And you basically just sample all of them and average the samples for each one. So in Markov chain Monte Carlo, variables condition each other. They influence each other on they can influence each other's values, and that essentially ends up defining the Markov chain. When you combine probabilities, you're basically reducing the effective volume of your search space, but the problem there is that you have to know which regions of your search space to search in, otherwise you're always going to be searching for a sample that isn't actually useful. So MCMC helps you narrow the search to places where you're likely to find values that satisfy the data and the conditions. So, how does Markov chain Monte Carlo work? It's actually remarkably simple. You need a Markov chain, Wikipedia it. You need a function that is at least proportional to the probability distribution that you care about. So here's how the algorithm works. You pick an initial state, just an assignment of all the variables. Then your Markov chain has a state transition matrix. And so you apply this to the state. This is literally just matrix multiplication, and you can do this on Wolfram Alpha. I totally did it this morning. You're literally just multiplying your state vector times the state transition matrix over and over and over again until it converges. So if your new state, the f of s prime over f of s is basically an error function. And so if that value exceeds 1, then your new state is definitely more likely than your previous state, so definitely accept it, and if not, then maybe accept it. And just keep doing this until it converges. So we've actually modeled a game that has no payoffs at all. The payoffs are completely hidden, and all we assume is that the players consider some actions to be cooperating and others to be defecting. So an outcome is this is the actions that happened. We're going to assume here that players are more or less paranoid, essentially. That's what this trust value is. That's what that ranges between 0 and 1. And so a strategy is, starting with the type of the player, i.e., how paranoid are they, and their previous action and the other player's previous action. What is the outcome? So here's an example of tit for tat. So confusingly, in this case, true means defect. So the second line of that bottom function is saying, in the case where I have, this is pattern matching in Haskell. So if, in the case where I have some trust value and it doesn't really matter, and the person defected on me last time, no matter what I did, my response is going to be selected from the Bernoulli distribution with p equals 0.9. And then in the opposite case, where the person cooperated last time, well, if we're really paranoid and suspicious, then maybe we're not sure they cooperated. So we're going to condition that on, we're not really sure we believe the evidence of our senses, and so we condition that outcome on the paranoia value. So this is, right, actually I'm going to bring both of these up. So this is the play function computes the, excuse me, so the play action basically models, what did the players do on the basis of what was played last round and what are their strategies. And then in the iterated game definition down there, A and B are paranoia values. And all we know about them is that, they're not conditioned on anything. They're just randomly chosen between, somewhere between, on a uniform distribution between 0 and 1. So that's nature's choice there. And we say that a game is 10 rounds. And the players are going to be playing the tit for tat. Each player is playing the tit for tat strategy, and their initial move is cooperate. And so then we simulate this over this array of input. So the left column is player A, the right column is player B. Player A never defects. Player B defects sometimes. And what's happening here is that we're passing the iterated game that we defined into the Markov chain Monte Carlo simulator, and then plotting the expected values of A's and B's paranoia. So you'll note that this is not a particularly tight distribution. A did cooperate, all of the time. So we're pretty sure that, that A is not that much of a whack job. And again, this is not a particularly tight distribution either. More data would certainly be useful, but we can see that, there's definitely a cluster around the center, and it's far less likely that the person is completely trusting or completely paranoid. So now we can add some more strategies to the game, such as all cooperate. Again, pattern matching. It doesn't matter how much, how paranoid the player is. It doesn't matter what they did what the other person did last round. It doesn't matter what they did last round. They're most likely just going to cooperate all the time. This distribution can also be taken to, count as a sort of a fuzz factor for noise on the channel. This is really, really inexact, and I don't like it. But we're building out more useful models.
This is like the reality. This is the reality of the world you live in. Even people that intend to cooperate all the time fuck up and accidentally hurt people. That's just how shit happens.
Well, he's right. I mean, yes, even people who intend to cooperate all the time do in fact screw up and hurt people. So yeah, and similarly, even people who defect all the time sometimes end up, screwing somebody into 6,800 pounds. And here's our buddy Grim Trigger again. In this case, we've got a more complicated set of pattern guards. So in the case where the other player defected last round, but I did not, then I'm almost certainly going to defect on them. If they did not defect and I did not defect, then I almost certainly will not. And so this guard actually captures all the past part, because in Grim Trigger, if you've defected on somebody before, then you're going to defect on them forever. So as long as as long as we defected on them at some point in the past, then we know that they're just a terrible person and we can't trust them ever. So we can also consider strategy to be a random variable. So we make that a data type choice among our strategies, and we'll make them equally likely across. Each category is going to be equally likely. And then we can do just exactly the same thing. We produce the we select the paranoia value as an unconditioned uniform random variable. And then we also select a random strategy. And what we're trying to infer this time is the strategies that the players are using. And again, we just pass this iterated this new game definition and the data that we had before, and try to infer what A's strategy and what B's strategy are based on the samples that we obtained. And it's pretty obvious. I mean, you could kind of tell from the data, right, that A cooperates all the time. Whereas B is probably playing tit for tat. There's a non-zero possibility that they're playing all defect and they're just really bad at it, but it's not anywhere near as likely, given the probability densities, that they're actually playing tit for tat. All right, so now that I've run way the hell over time, things I would like to do as time goes on. CPFR and I are already building out societal iterated prisoner's dilemma using probabilistic programming. I was really hoping to have that today, and I'm sorry that I don't. Societal iterated prisoner's dilemma with signaling, because that would be cool. I mean, people actually talk to each other before they make decisions. In fact, that's how information gets around, people talking. You know, we don't really have. In the real world, we don't have perfect information. We don't have this complete history of everything that's ever happened in the world, and so you know we can restrict our sampling to kind of model the imperfectness of information in the real world. But you know, similarly, it would also be nice to be able to look at noise on the channel and whether the channel is one that you can even make decisions about. Coordination. I guess I got, yeah. I'm bad at coordination too, and I guess we're done. Thank you, everybody.
One quick question.
Yo.
In a situation